Hello, everybody. Welcome to the 13th Mapping Ancient Africa seminar. Today we have Andrea Manica. How do I pronounce your last name? Manica. Sorry, I was practicing that and I still got it wrong. So Andrea Manica, he's going to be talking to us about reconstructing past climate changes using his nice new software in R. So Andrea, over to you.
Thank you very much, Will. So let me share the screen and start the presentation. So hopefully you all got.
Yep, looks
a
good.
nice view. Fantastic. Okay, so I guess the first thing I should say is that I'm going to talk about lots of work that has been done by other people, really. So there is a big team of postdocs and PhD students that have been behind quite a lot of things I'm going to show you today. So I'm going to use the usual kind of sword speak of PIs. So quick translation for the talk. When I say we did, it's generally my postdoc and graduate students who did it. I was sitting in my office. And when I say we think, someone nicely came over and explained it to me, and I thought it was a great idea. So now I was going to then sell it to you as if it was mine. But generally, that we is very much they did all the hard work. So what's the problem that we're going to try to solve today? So I guess as an ecologist, one of the things that often we want to do is try to set data in context. We're often quite interested in looking at the responses of species to changes in the environment. And one of the things that has been very limiting really until recently has been a lack of good time series of climate reconstructions. So there are some fantastic resources out there if you want a few time slices, and you can get your mid-Holocene, your maybe late Holocene, your LGM, paleoclim that I've highlighted here is probably one of the best known resources for that. And so there are a few kind of classical times effectively that have been reconstructed in rather methodical way, sometimes with multiple climate models. The problem is that there are really little snapshots, and for a lot of biological problems, anthropological problems, and actually quite often if we want to, in a way, relate climate reconstructions by models with proxies, what we want is more of a time series through time to actually see all the fluctuations. And having only 2 or 3 time points isn't really good enough. Now, there's been a big move in a way over the last 10 years. We've started seeing a few big data sets actually coming up that try to reconstruct climate through time. There are a couple of transients. There are sometimes models that have been used repeatedly. The issue that we had as users in a way of these models was that each of those data sets tend to have its website. Sometimes they are quite well organized, sometimes they're not so well organized. And quite often they tend to just have very different file structures and types of files that describe the data. And we found that particularly challenging, and I know we're not the only one. That's something that has been discussed quite a bit among groups that try to do this kind of work, trying to look at responses of species back in time. And so really one of the kind of needs that became apparent a few years ago was to have a little bit of an infrastructure to start having this kind of time series of various variables for the whole world, ideally, in a simple structure manner, so that you could actually compare them and you could effectively line up any empirical data, whether it's proxies or whether it's actually remains of animals or genetics, and literally interrogate what the climate reconstruction would give you. And so that's what we did over the last couple of years, is actually to build up some of these data sets in the first place. And also we're going to discuss in a minute how to make them more sort of relevant for the kind of questions that at least ecologists and anthropologists tend to have. And that's how pastclim was born. So I'm going to discuss a little bit what pastclim does and what kind of data sets are available through pastclim. And then I'm going to show you 3 little highlights of the kind of work that we've done over the last couple of years, actually leveraging this type of resource. So we're going to start by looking at selection and speciation in humans, looking at how brain size and body size have changed through time and trying to see how climate might be a driver for some of those changes. We're going to then think about a shorter period within humans, looking at how climate has shaped major genetic lineages. And we're going to see again how we can leverage semi-continuous reconstructions of climate to really ask questions quantitatively out of genetic data, linking those genetic data directly to the climate. And finally, we're going to look at how by building species distribution models, so by characterizing the climate that is typical of the locations where fossils of certain animals are found, we can actually look at the niche used by those animals and also query whether that niche changes through time over a period which is much shorter, which is about 50,000 years or 40,000 years, from 50 to 10,000 years. So let's start with this idea of pastclim. So pastclim is a library in R. And I guess the dream that I had, and pastclim delivers it for us, and we've even had undergraduates using it now for their projects, is that it should be really simple in principle to say, I have a couple of locations and I would like to know what the temperature was for a given period of time. So in a way, if I have some locations, I should just be able to create very quickly a plot like this, where we have a number of locations and we have some temperature. A couple of those locations end up underwater and therefore they don't show up, for example. Some of them might be available for some part of the time and not available for others, like the purple one. The idea with pastclim, if there is a website and a set of tutorials for that, is that literally with 2 or 3 lines of code, you can get that reconstruction. And the important thing is that in principle, by simply changing the data set that you're using, you can start exploring what kind of reconstruction would you get from different types of climate reconstructions, from different climate models. The other thing that we do a lot as ecologists, though, is to think on a bigger scale and not just on a few sites. And pastclim is equally able to just give you a map of a particular variable. So this is bio1, which is again the mean annual temperature, where we can get it for a particular region. We can plot our points. We can see the reconstructions of the ice sheets for this particular time point. And again, the idea is that in 2 or 3 lines, you can just get that. And by simply changing the name of the data set that you're using, you can actually compare different models. So at the moment, there are 2 sets of data which are available in pastclim. They are the data that we have generated the last few years and made publicly available for this kind of ecological work. I'm going to discuss those in a second. There are more data sets coming. We have been discussing a bit with other data producers for this kind of reconstructions of climate through time. And actually, again, if you look at a website of pastclim, there is a whole section dedicated on explaining how you would take any data set and effectively shape it in a way that it can then be used by pastclim. So effectively, we've made pastclim very much not just a tool for our data, but a tool where you can compare data because in a way, models are models. I think models are useful. I think models quite often have a lot of things that they get right. We also know that they got lots of things that they get wrong. So I think it's going to be really important in the future to be able to start comparing the various climate reconstructions, as one is already in a way used to do very much when looking at particular time points like the Holocene of the LGM. But that's not really been possible with this kind of reconstruction through time. We've all been using our own data sets and not really been comparing them with others because they've been relatively few. And as I said, it's not easy to manipulate these very large data sets. So what we have available at the moment in pastclim, if you want to play with it, is there is a reconstruction of the last 120,000 years at steps of 2 to 1,000 years, depending on where you are, using actual global circulation model reconstructions. And then we got 800,000 years at 1,000 year steps using a statistical emulator of GCMs. So what is that latter data set and why did we actually create it? So you're going to be familiar with global circulation models. I guess the reality is that there are global circulation models at very high resolution, like the AM3H that is over there, which has got about 1 degree latitude and longitude resolution. There are very few selected time slices. They're often not comparable because they've been run with rather different models. They're quite expensive. They're actually not used that much in paleoclimate reconstructions. They also have the habit of being a little bit fiddly for sort of having a lot of moving parts and being quite fine-tuned for the present and struggling a bit when you move them to the past. Then there are models like the HAD-CM3, which are actually in a way an older generation of global circulation models. They're still pretty complex, but they are on a larger spatial scale and also to some extent have a slightly simpler physics compared to the latest models. And here it gets more interesting because some of these models have actually been used to run multiple time slices with the same settings. So in a way here, then you have a pretty good way of comparing what's happening through time because it's the same model with the same settings, therefore to some extent the same biases and same problems, but through time. So that is actually what we have, for example, in pastclim for the 120,000 years is HAD-CM3, which has then been further downscale and debiased to try to make it as relevant as possible for ecologists, because to some extent we know that models have biases and we can correct for them. But we're going to talk about that a little bit later. And finally, the other kind of data sets that you can get if you want to think about this kind of reconstructions through time are EMICs. These are Earth models of intermediate complexity. pastclim is probably the one that is quite sort of commonly used at the moment. There are some fantastic transients with pastclim that cover now up to 3 million years. And we're definitely going to add them at some point to pastclim. It's just a question of time to, again, reprocess a bit of data and reshape them a bit in a way that then is easy to work with and plot and extract. Now, one of the things that has bothered us for a few years, though, is the fact that in a way, if you look at these EMICs, they are brilliant for creating transient and time series, but resolution actually does matter quite a bit. And this just gives you a very good feeling of what happens when you change resolution with models. So what we have here is for Africa, actually for modern Africa, the temperatures and precipitation. So what you have here is for each cell in the continent, you have their mean temperature and their total precipitation over the year. And that contour in gray is the real climatology that you have for Africa. And so what we then have here is what a high resolution global circulation model gives you. As you can see, it fills in quite well that space, but it's got a bit of a bias here. It struggles to create these particularly dry climates in the right way. You can see that HAD-CM3 does something that is not too bad, quite close, but again, at that point, it gets a bigger bias of climatologies that is missing. And a lower resolution like pastclim has got even more of a restricted representation of the real climate. Now, you can downscale, obviously, this kind of simulations and try to recover some of that variability. But I think, to me at least, it's still a really big open question to what extent that downscaling can actually recover the full variability back in time. And I think that's very much an open question when thinking about this kind of models. So what we tried a couple of years ago, and I think it worked pretty well, was to try to take the simulations that we had for HAD-CM3, this number of runs that cover the last 120,000 years, and attempt to build a statistical emulator for the GCM so that we could actually start creating more reconstructions, but without all the computational work that goes into running a GCM. And the logic is actually quite simple. So a global circulation model at the end of the day really only has three major input to some extent, boundary conditions that we have to worry and think about. We have the orbital parameters, we have the greenhouse gases, which is mostly CO2 when we think back about climate reconstructions. And so to some extent, these input parameters go into a complex kind of black box in a way of physics, and eventually we generate reconstructions. Obviously, one has to think about sea level and which cells are above sea level and which ones are, on the other hand, in the water. But overall, the concept, if you want to actually, when you just consider the model as a black box, is pretty straightforward. You put in some inputs and some outputs come out. So what we did was actually to think that if we had run that HAD-CM3 model multiple times, in this case 72 times, with a variety of input parameters, we might be able to actually build a statistical model that would allow us to predict what the model would do if we were only to change some of those parameters. And so the logic goes as follows. Just imagine that we focus on one particular cell. And I'm afraid my example here is for the Americas rather than for Africa, but the same stands for Africa. So the idea here is that what we have is the temperature reconstructed by HAD-CM3 for that one cell over there. Now, what we can do is we can actually think, again, those temperatures were generated by the combination of set of input parameters. And so we got CO2, which, unsurprisingly, has got a big impact on the temperature, but there are also the other orbital parameters. And some of them don't have a particularly strong signal when you look at it that way. But if you think about them as a multiple regression, as a set of multiple predictors that eventually define temperature, we find that we can combine them and actually get a pretty good reconstruction. So here what you have is that the dots are the real GCM, and the blue line is the emulator. So these are effectively reconstructing what the GCM would do from the inputs that is given. Now you can build a relationship for that one little square. You can then effectively do the same for another square. And in principle, you can just go over and do it for the whole map. Now, suddenly, if you do it for the whole map, you have effectively an emulator for a GCM, and you have to build up rules so that you deal with the fact that sometimes it might go under ice or sometimes might go underwater. But in principle, it's just a bunch of simple statistical models that take inputs and try to predict the outputs in terms of temperature and precipitation for different months. So what you can do is you can look at how well the HAD-CM3 does compared to its emulator. So here in orange, you got the mean temperature for the world based on the HAD-CM3. You then have in blue what the emulator is recreating. As you can see, obviously it's got exactly the same limits as the original model, because if you look at, again, a temperature from oxygen stacks, you can see that here HAD-CM3 tends to hit the actual variability from the stack, and the emulator has got exactly the same limits. So bear in mind that the emulator here is not really doing any better than the original model. The big thing, though, is that we can then start running the emulator back in time. And as you can see, the emulator doesn't do too badly at all. So here you can see how the emulator, now going in periods where we don't quite have a straight GCM reconstruction, but through the relationship that is built among those input variables, is actually able to track pretty well the reconstructions of temperature from proxies. And what we've done is also to try and compare how the emulator does going back 800,000 years against a number of proxies, both marine and terrestrial. And generally, as you can see, the relationships are not too bad. We compare them also, for example, with IMIX, and actually they are on the same level of correlation of a complete transient that you get from pastclim, for example. And it does actually marginally better, even though only a little bit compared to an IMIC for some of these proxies. So the bottom line here is we actually got a pretty good emulator in principle, and you can play with those results. Again, bear in mind that is not going to outperform, for example, the original HCM3, but it seems to be on par in terms of qualitatively reconstructing the world. So the other thing that we've then been worrying about, so in principle here then we have a tool, and indeed we put out those data a couple of years ago for reconstructing the last 800,000 years at kind of GCM quality rather than EMIX quality. Now, the other thing that we worried a lot about though was actually how to move from climate model to reconstructions which are closer to the proxies, in a way closer to reality. And I have to say we were a little bit surprised by the relatively limited amount of efforts that have been made to contrast and compare different downscaling approaches. Now, there is a huge field of looking at downscaling for the present and for the future. There is much less that has been done looking back into the past. So this was our attempt a couple of years ago, taking effectively a couple of big collections of proxies that were available from previous studies and try to compare different methods for downscaling our GCM reconstructions, moving them from a couple of degrees latitude and longitude resolution down to half a degree lat and long, and seeing how much we actually improve our fits to proxies in terms of debiasing the model as well as downscaling it. So, and then we looked at how well we were doing against the mid-Holocene, the last glacial maximum, and the last interglacial. As you can see from the blue and the reds, sometimes you actually reduce the error, sometimes you even increase a little bit. Overall, you mostly improve it. One of the things that became apparent, and I think is something very interesting, especially for people working on proxies to think about, was how poor, quite frankly, those collections were in terms of quality control. So a lot of those collections are merely collections of everything that has ever been reconstructed. And one of the things that we found was situations like the one here that you can possibly see is a little bit small over in Alaska, where we managed to basically, by downscaling, improve a lot one point, here in light blue, not do much to another one, and do really badly with another one. Now, those are locations within a couple of 100 kilometers, and I think they have a difference in reconstructed temperature of something like 20 or 25 degrees, which I think is somewhat implausible. So what we found in a way was really this difficulty that there are collations, but there is no quality control to it. There is no standardization of the methods that have been used to reconstruct the temperatures from those proxies. And if you give it in the hands of a Philistine like myself, who doesn't do proxy record, we can only take them and use them. But to some extent, that limited, I have to say, our ability to think about more sophisticated downscaling and debiasing approaches, because actually what we saw, quite frankly, was that the simpler debiasing and downscaling approaches were the best ones, probably because they are quite noddy, quite simple. And so despite all the noise that there is in the data, we end up with something okay, but we couldn't leverage the more sophisticated approaches because that kind of number of errors in the proxies prevented us from using anything more sophisticated. Now, I think the world is changing there because over the last few years, there have definitely been a couple of more kind of curated collections of empirical data that are definitely very interesting. We contributed one a few years ago with a large consortium of glaciologists trying to build up maps, curated maps of ice sheets through time, trying to bring in all the evidence that was available and trying to characterize it also in terms of how reliable it was. And there is something I'm very excited about, which is legacy climate. And we're definitely ready now to start sort of testing our reconstructions against legacy climate on a battery of 2,594 different time series to see actually how well we're doing and whether different methods, for example, of downscaling might actually do better against an actual set of proxy, which has been standardized to a good extent. So I think there is, at least from my side, a big excitement on the fact that these collations are definitely improving, but I think we're still a bit of a way from having kind of good and user-friendly curated collations that then can be added to with nice, clear methodologies. We're definitely trying to push that from the side of the models to try, so that in a way, then you can also test those collations against multiple models and be able to see how different the results are with different models. So this is what pastclim can do for you. Effectively, it allows you to create both maps as well as time series of climate at different points in time, in principle for different models. At the moment, only 2 of them, but definitely more by the end of the year. What I'd like to do now is just give you a little sort of tour of the kind of things that we've done with these models and what ecologists and anthropologists can actually do when these kind of data sets are available. So the first is going to be a look at a big question in human evolution, which is in the changes in body and brain size that we see in humans over the last 1,000,000 years. And again, I have to say here, there was a big issue of standardization because there are a large number of just stories about why brain size and body size might actually change so much over the last 1,000,000 years. We work with some archaeologists and anthropologists to see whether we could first start, in a way, categorizing a lot of these just stories into a set of hypotheses with a clear framework. And actually what we realize is a lot of arguments actually really impinge fundamentally on 4 rather simple basic ideas, using potentially slightly different variables, but the logic there could actually be categorized in these 4 big classes. So the first one was an idea of environmental stress, where effectively size of the body or size of the brain was actually used to buffer against this environmental stress. So if you think about here the variable, for example, being temperature, what we're saying is that you would be large when it's cold, for example, and you then be smaller when it's warmer. And the same would apply for the brain size, with the idea that brain size might be linked to cognitive abilities, and that will give you, again, some buffering against that environmental stress. Other arguments, though, went completely in the opposite direction and actually argued that in terms of resources, the environment is actually a constraint, and so is good resources, good places that allow you to be large. And on the other hand, fewer resources means that you're small. The other set of domains of arguments for why body and brain size might actually be affected by the environment link to variability in the environment, on the other hand. So the idea here is that if you have high variability in the environment, you would actually have a large body or brain size, again, basically to buffer you from this kind of stress. So the stress here is not the absolute characteristic of the environment, but it's more its variability, and therefore in a way is unpredictability over time. Whereas if you have an environment which is much more stable, you don't need to buffer, and so you can just get your optimal body and brain size to be smaller. A set of arguments, though, went again in exactly the opposite direction and said is environmental consistency that is the key to be large. So it's actually in environments that are not very variable that you can grow big, both in terms of body and brains, and very variable environments, on the other hand, prevent you from having the resources to invest in this kind of large sizes. Now, a lot of these arguments have been made in the past, either without really an explicit sort of test against climate, or sometimes simply a test against an oxygen 18 curve, which obviously gives you an idea of the major climatology through time, but doesn't tell you anything about what those particular individuals from which the remains come from were experiencing, especially given that some might have been in Africa, some in Asia, some in different places, and that those kind of different places actually have completely different types of climate. So what we did was to work and collate data from all available reconstructions that we have for the last 1,000,000 years of body sizes and brain sizes. And then what we did was to extract from those kind of data sets that you've just seen, the prevailing climatology for those remains at those times, and then started testing whether we could find a relationship between body size and any of the variables that would underpin those 4 hypotheses. So what we found was that when we actually looked at body size, there was really just one variable that predicted body size well, and that was mean annual temperature. And this was following very much the environmental stress idea, where basically colder temperatures underpin larger body sizes and warmer temperature underpin smaller body sizes. And this actually works well for three different taxonomic units that we considered, which was the mid-Pleistocene Homos, so the way everything sort of 500,000 years and before, Neanderthals, and then the Pleistocene Homo sapiens. Now, what you can see here is that some points are dark and some points are lighter because there was a lot of resampling to avoid having multiple remains from the same location becoming too important in analysis. There was also a lot of resampling because obviously dates are uncertain. And so we generated thousands of data sets with different dates that sample within the interval of uncertainty that we had. But we got very clear sort of patterns through these sort of working over the uncertainty. Now, we were somewhat surprised to see that actually when we looked at brain size, the stories didn't quite work in the same way. And also the variables involved in predicting brain size were very different from body size. So in brain size, there was an effect that we could find mostly for the mid-Pleistocene Homo, a little bit for Neanderthal, but not for Homo sapiens, of net primary productivity, where actually large brains are found in areas of low net primary productivity. What we think is going on here, but it's very much a speculation, is that we might be looking at the cognitive capabilities that are needed for hunting megafauna in open habitat, which tends to have a lower net primary productivity than the more densely forested areas. And so it seems so that that kind of extra, in a way, cognitive pressure was there in the earlier part of Homo for the last million years. But once we get to sapiens, that effect is not there anymore. It might just be that at that point the brain has reached a certain size where that doesn't matter so much. On the other hand, what we found was a clear effect in all the three taxonomic units when we actually look at variability. And this was this idea of variability in terms of consistency. So actually low variability underpinned larger body sizes for all the three categories that we considered. And there was a nice clear relationship. What we found, though, was that the effects for brain size were definitely weaker than the ones we find for body size. So body size was definitely much more influenced by the environment. Brain size was probably influenced by other factors quite a bit more, which is not too surprising all in all. So this kind of climate reconstructions allowed us to really, in a way, drill down to individual specimens and start looking at what conditions were characterizing those specimens, and therefore ask questions quantitatively about them. The other thing that we've been using these reconstructions for is actually to see whether we can understand a little bit more the drivers of some of the genetic patterns that we see in humans. So if we look at the genetics of humans, what we have is that there are some big, rather distinct to some extent, lineages back in time. And then when you look at sort of all the more recent papers about human genetics that talk about, say, Neolithic expansion or Bronze Age, or basically the era of food production, there tends to be a lot of mixing, but mixing tend to actually involve some, in a way, ancestral lineages, which were there for quite a while in the past. And so the question is, how do these fundamental lineages, in a way, actually come about? How do you get these separations within the species that then eventually, once movement becomes much greater in once food production arrives, then mix? And again, here there is, it's easy in a way to make just those stories, but what we attempted to do was to bring climate into an explicit way to inform the reconstructions that we do for the genetics. And we do that through a series of approaches that we call climate-informed spatial genetic models, or SysGem to keep it short. So the idea here is that you can take a number of genomes. So in this case, we got a bunch of mostly ancient genomes before food production. We have a couple of contemporary hunter-gatherers for the areas where we don't have any ancient genetics. And the logic goes as follows. You got a bunch of individuals. You then bring in your climate reconstructions, and you start thinking about rules that would actually underpin the demography through time. So if we're looking at humans, we need to think about the last 300,000 years with the expansion out of Africa, eventual expansions into the Americas, the impact of ice sheets. But all in all, we can think about all these big events as a simple demographic model with 6 or 7 parameters. And we're going to start not putting any information about those parameters. We just got a range from which those parameters could come from. We can then sample individual values for those parameters and effectively then run the world. So we can actually let population expand and see whether those parameters allow us to get out of Africa, reach the Americas, and get there at the appropriate times to be able to generate our ancient genomes. Because that's what we do afterwards, is once we have the demography, we can actually run genetic simulations, see what our genetics predicts in terms of the differences among those individuals, and then effectively select demographic parameters that reconstruct the genetics in a realistic way. Now, this is an approach that is called approximate Bayesian computation, because from the good models and effectively rejecting the bad models, we can actually end up with some posterior distributions of those parameters. And so we can define the kind of precipitation regimes or temperatures or migration rates or growth rates that would be needed to give you a realistic demography, given the climate reconstructions and given the genetics that need to be generated by this kind of demographies. So let's see what we can do if we try to approach this kind of question about humans with this type of models. So the first thing is that these models actually do manage to fit the genetics really well. So here I have only a couple of examples of the genetic characteristics that we can look at. Normally, we tend to look at how different 2 genomes are. So here you have different pairwise comparisons of genomes, and you just got 2 pairs plotted against each other. In black, you have all that the model can generate with various parameters. In red, you have the real value in the real world. And then in blue, you have what we consider pretty good simulations that we often look at. But as you can see, basically, the model wanders around. It creates lots of scenarios which are completely implausible, but it also ends up with some scenarios which are absolutely bang on, and they do manage to reconstruct all the possible pairwise differentiation between all the different samples. And if you look at the kind of demographies that it generates, the type of, for example, population densities that it generates, these are for effectively the recent present before food production. We see they're actually very much in line with reconstructions that have been made by anthropologists using, for example, current hunter-gatherers. So it looks like what we have is realistic. So what does that then tell us about climate? So what do these kind of parameters actually tell us about how climate was affecting humans? So one of the most interesting parameters to look at is the minimum amount of precipitation that is needed for humans to persist. So the model starts with a lot of possible values, but it actually selects eventually a rather narrow range of values that are sort of compatible with the genetics. And they're basically in the order of about 100 to 115 millimeters of rainfall per year. And what we have here is what that means if we look at the connectivity between Africa and Eurasia. And so what you have here is that in green, it would mean that is connected, and in white, it means that it's not connected. So if you had a critical precipitation, if you needed a lot of rainfall for our model to put people in a certain place, there would just be no connectivity between Africa and Eurasia. On the other hand, if they needed really little rain, less than 80 millimeters of rainfall, everything would be connected all the time. Actually, what the model selects is a very narrow situation where there are a number of bursts over the last 70,000 years of connectivity, and then a stop to that connectivity, and then again some connectivity. So to generate the right genetics to basically differentiate Africans and Eurasians enough, what we actually need is the right level of drought tolerance, not too much, not too little. So it turns out this amount actually is what you find in a kind of xeric shrubland, which is bordering desert. And one thing that we should be careful about here is scale. So remember that we're working on a pretty large scale still, a half a degree by half a degree. So it's quite possible that within that type of environment, in reality, humans were using the better pockets, which might have been a little valley with a bit more humidity. It is not to say that that is exactly the kind of landscape that humans could have used. Having said that, if we look at what modern hunter-gatherers can do, that is pretty much their limit. So what you have here as a histogram in blue is the level of precipitation that we see in modern hunter-gatherers. And you can see that actually just below 120 is where they pretty much disappear. So there are three populations here that actually can go below that, but they cheat. So if you actually look at where they live close to underground water sources that allow them to persist despite that kind of aridity. Interesting enough, that is also the threshold that you have for finding grazers. So above 90 millimeters of rainfall is when you actually start finding some grazer biomass. Below that, there are no grazers. You really get into the desert. So it's a very interesting number there from, in a way, anthropology and ecology that also comes out in genetics. Finally, just one thing to say, though, is if you try to use this threshold and go back in the past, here we've done it for the last 300,000 years. What we plotted here is the moments when people might have come out of Africa. And what you see is that there are lots of really good times to come out of Africa way before 60,000 years ago. So this is really not resolving the problem of why there might have been earlier incursions into Eurasia that were not as successful before. There were definitely windows for people to keep coming out of. And there's now much better archaeological evidence compared to when we published that paper that show indeed that people were in Arabia at various moments in time, which actually are very much coherent with some of our windows. The other thing that the model really highlights is the role of mountains coming out of Africa and getting to Eurasia. So this is a different way of plotting the results. We're now looking not at population densities, but we're actually tracing back the genetic lineages and seeing when these genetic lineages find a common ancestor. So we're looking in a way at where two lineages actually meet. And what you can see is that we got lots of these common ancestors on that expansion, both left and right to some extent, but actually not the Caucasus. So the Caucasus acts as a really good barrier for that movement. And we actually know that because that population there is the Caucasus hunter-gatherers, and that's a genetic lineage that we discovered a few years ago, which is very distinct from other hunter-gatherers found further north. And you can see that the model does that even in areas where we don't have many samples. It actually skirts, for example, the Gobi Desert and the Himalayas, and it basically goes north and south, which again is a pattern that we see in modern human genetics from populations that were not sampled by that particular model. And finally, what we see is that, on the other hand, the Urals don't really act as a barrier. And again, in terms of biogeography, the Urals are not a particularly big barrier in terms of animal distributions. Finally, in terms of what the model tells us about cold climates, what we see is that the model actually does reconstruct the existence of people in very cold climates. In a way, we know that because that's a sample called Yana, which is found at 32,000 years ago, and is found in one of the coldest places in Siberia that you could possibly imagine. So it's not surprising that the model also suggests that people should actually be living at these very high latitudes. Interesting, though, the model actually prescribes that they should be found at very low densities to actually get the genetics right. And that, in a way, makes sense if you think in terms of biology. We would expect those populations to be pretty thin on the ground at such in such extreme conditions, and that's indeed what we see. And so then moving on, so we've seen how well climate can, in a way, explain why we have these genetic lineages that are basically the result of these barriers and these moments of expansion. The final thing that I want to show you very quickly is just some work that we've done recently, looking at how the niche can change over time. So I'm a little bit short of time, so I'll simplify this a little bit in terms of logic, but the issue is the following. When we try to look at changes in the niche in a classical way with only a few time steps, what we tend to do is we're trying to just use a few samples for a particular time step, reconstruct the niche for that time step, then do that again for another time step and another time step and another time step. What tends to happen is because we normally have relatively few fossil remains for a particular period, is that we tend to underestimate the niche for that particular time slice. And what we've seen over and over again is when people do that, they tend to actually detect some major changes in the niche pretty much at every time step. So effectively what's happening here is that a niche that here was changing gradually. So here you got some fictitious variable that could be temperature, where we have a pretty constant niche and then it gets a little bit bigger towards the end. If we were to just reconstruct it from a few remains that are scattered on the landscape, and we just, in a way, squeeze those remains into a few little time steps, we tend to underestimate and kind of squeeze it effectively into a few time slices. On the other hand, what we've been doing is actually using methods that we also use, actually looking at how animals use habitat in a more continuous time. We've got lots of ecological studies where we can actually follow the niche through time as a time series. So rather than actually squeezing our data into a few time steps, we actually consider the data as a continuous time series. And that is a much more natural way that actually covers up to some extent the fact that we might have a little bit of undersampling in some sort of moments compared to others. So we actually applied this method to 4 ungulates recently. So we looked at horses, aurochs, red deer, and wild boar. And the really interesting result is that for all of them, we can actually detect a niche change over the last 50,000 years. But that niche change really occurs specifically during the last glacial. And what happens is that there is an expansion of niche at that point. It's kind of interesting because it's not happening during the glacial maximum. What we think is actually most probably a response to a number of other megafauna species that go extinct. And that is the moment when the niches actually expand, because in a way there is more space in the community when some of the other species are disappearing. But the interesting thing here is that we can actually see a change in the way the animals actually use their sort of available habitat in a period of only 40,000 years in rather long-lived ungulates. So that's a kind of really interesting sort of set of responses, even though some of those changes, we need to be careful, might not be in a way adaptation of those animals, but more a change in the whole community. And I think it's going to be interesting to start thinking, quite frankly, more and more in that direction. So just to conclude, I hope I've convinced you that with this kind of, in a way, continuous climate reconstructions, we can now start asking some really exciting questions about a number of species and their responses to the environment. But the idea is also really that hopefully we're putting out a tool out there that allows us to start contrasting climate models with empirical data in a simpler way for this kind of time series, not just a few time slices, and potentially also start doing the kind of analysis I've just shown you, which normally tend to rely on just one model. We've used ours, others have used pastclim, but actually create a nice infrastructure allows you to test this kind of ideas against multiple models and see what is robust to the vagaries of each of the individual models. So thank you very much for listening. And as a pointer, pastclim is free. All those reconstructions and all the data sets that we use are always out there in the open domain available. I think that's really important. And all the work that we have, you can grab it easily. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Andrea. That was really, really great and a very nice tour through yeah, the mechanics of the of how the package works and yeah, what you can do with it. So some great examples. Questions from the audience. Neil, you've jumped up there. Go for it.
I got a dash off, so I'm trying to jump in quickly. It's really fantastic, Andrea. I really love that. I just wanted to make a bit of a plug for a time series that we've just done going back 5 million with millennial time slices using emulators for plasm genie, and it'd be really great to get that in there. If we could get that up on your system, that'd be wonderful.
You know, let's have a virtual coffee or real coffee, and let's do it. We're definitely not. To me, as I say, the excitement is actually to put all these various approaches together, because I don't think that ours is that superior to the others. I think each of them has got its own good points and bad points, quite frankly.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, our model has plus and minus. We do our emulation different way to you and various things. So yeah, no, fantastic. I'll get on to you with that. But fantastic. Thanks for a great talk. I've got to run, but thanks very much.
Yeah, let's be in touch.
Cheers, Neil. Thank you.
Cheers. Thanks, Will. Yeah, thanks for hosting.
We have 2 hands raised in the chat. Ezekiel, I think, was first. Ezekiel, can you shout out or type your message into the chat?
Yes, I'm here.
Oh, yes. Say your question.
So good afternoon, and thank you very much for the insight on paleoclimate generally. I'm a geologist, and my undergrad was more on sedimentology, and I look at paleoclimate of some deposition in southern part of Nigeria. So I got a lot more of insight because my work was not so much on paleoclimate, but I've got a lot of insight and how well I can improve them over time. Maybe I'm looking forward to producing a paper and all that. But my question is, can we, because I code in Python, so and most of those stuffs are in R. So is there a way we can actually have a Python library, or maybe there are other approach for people that code in Python? I don't know.
So when we actually release the data for the 800,000 years, we also release a bunch of scripts in Python and in MATLAB and in R to use the data. So they're not a full library. They're just a couple of examples in Python on how you would do it. So at the moment, I have to confess, we don't have a particular plan to build the same library in Python, even though it would, in a way, if anyone who is familiar with Python wants to play with it, I'd be more than happy. We use Python quite a bit. I guess for the reason why we did it in R was because the majority of the kind of ecologists and archaeologists, anthropologists that work on climate tend to use R. I'd be more than happy to support a port to Python because it would make a lot of sense. We just happen at the moment, I guess, not to have the manpower to do that. But there are definitely scripts. And so if you look at the repository for the 800,000 years, there are actually scripts in Python that shows you how you would grab those data and use them. It's just not, I guess what it lacks is that kind of pastclim generalities. More, we made sure that our data were easily accessible in multiple languages. But still each data set then is a little bit different. And even despite this one group, we've managed to put out 2 data sets, and I confess they're not completely coherent on all and every single detail because of different people putting them together. Hindsight is a wonderful thing. I regret that, but it just happens. But I mean, if you had though any issue with Python and working with those data,
I will look into the Python repository. Because I just saw the event on Twitter yesterday, so I decided to open it. So I didn't have so much information, but after the meeting, I'll definitely do my research and see how well I can go about it in Python.
And if you have some particular problems in Python, yeah, send me an email. I would be happy to see whether we can expand those scripts at the least to make them more user friendly if it's needed.
Okay, that's nice.
Great.
Thank you
very much, and great that you could join us, and the Twitter adverts are working. So that's great. I also see that Daniel Olago has his hand up on the chat. Daniel.
Yes. Thank you very much. And Andrea, that was a really, really enjoyable talk, and I loved every minute of it. Now, just 2 questions. One of them is that you mentioned about the minimum precipitation that allows humans to exist. But at the same time, the models, all of them had some issue with, really predicting a lot of variability and uncertainty with low precipitation. So really, how much confidence do you have in terms of, the extrapolations way into the geological past? How much confidence do you really have on that? And the second question relates to the genetic, that tracing of the, mobility of the different genetic groups, and noting, of course, that mountains are scattered by them. But would it not just be that the mountain environments were not really conducive for humans and animals to live in, except for maybe some few adapted species, so that the reconstruction is not really so much related to the mountains being barriers as such, but more that they are not that conducive to living? Thank you.
Absolutely. So 2 excellent questions. So on the first one, yeah, absolutely. Those kind of dry areas are a problem. I guess my confidence is medium to high, but not super high, in the sense that we have contrasted those reconstructions with the proxies that are available for those regions, and they do reasonably well. So I don't think they're completely far off. I would be very keen to be able to start repeating some of those things with different also climate models, and ideally having more proxies which have clear, nice time series where you can really query those models and see how well they're doing. So I would say at the moment, I think that generally the biggest patterns are likely to be sensible. I mean, the periods that we highlighted as the most likely sort of periods for out of Africa were also then the periods when literally 2 weeks later, a paper in Nature highlighted presence in the Arabian Peninsula. So I think we're getting that right. What I don't know, to be honest, is whether we're getting the southern versus northern route right, for example. I think that's much more tricky. On that one, I would say I have definitely lower confidence on whether that's whether we can get that correctly or not. So I think that's what I would say. So I would say, no, I don't think it's completely made up. I think it definitely will be interesting to see how robust certain details are to that sort of uncertainty of the models. In terms of the genetics, I think you're perfectly correct. I think it's actually a combination of the 2 effects. So one is that mountains are, I mean, in a way, though, if a mountain is not a very good place where to live, it is effectively a barrier because you have to go around it and you can't go into it. So that still effectively shapes your expansion dynamics because you can't really colonize it or genetically also. So I think there is also an interesting thing here to think about what we mean sort of as a barrier genetically, because it might indeed be that a few people get into the mountains, but there are so few that there is no gene flow through those very scattered populations. It's a little bit also like those very northern populations in Siberia. Yes, the model predicts that there would be people, but they're very few, and therefore there isn't that much gene flow going around because it's such a scattered set of populations. So those end up being barriers, even though it's not the mountain itself that you can't cross, but it's just the kind of environment which is too harsh to live in. So absolutely, Daniel, that you're completely right that it's not just, in a way, I've said, generally don't think about mountains very much as this kind of insurmountable barrier because it's vertical. I think about it as a barrier more because it's a place where you can't live. It's just the conditions are too harsh. You might be able to go there maybe for part of the season, but you definitely not kind of establish yourself there.
Right, thank you. And can I just ask one more question? And this is just your own opinion. From the 4 different hypotheses that you posed at the beginning,
yeah.
Which one of them do you really think runs predominantly with the model that with the outputs that you have generated? Which one is most supported? Is it the variability? Is it the environmental stress?
I mean, based on the models, is basically the environmental stress for body size and the environmental consistency for brain size. That's definitely what we had. Is the only thing is that the proportional variance you explain in body size and brain size is quite different. You explain quite a lot of the changes in body size from climate. You explain only a much smaller proportion of the changes in brain size from climate. There is obviously much more than climate going on for brain size.
Okay, so some more refining of those hypotheses are needed as well. Thank you.
Absolutely. I think that was the end of our paper, actually pointing out that you need to think about other things other than climate.
Yeah.
Someone needs to give me some data sets to actually think about the whole cultural side of it, which is not trivial.
Yeah, thank you. Fantastic. I really enjoyed your work. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, great. We're at our hour now. Is there any final burning question for Andrea? No, not even Manu. Manu's he twitched. I saw him.
Well, you said burning. There's no burning question for me. I would definitely like to talk more because maybe I should have started. I really enjoyed the talk and the diversity of applications. That really great stuff. And I think there's quite some potential for the data set and the tool itself. Yeah, maybe we should just meet and talk at some point because I just have not one burning question, but the millions of.
That sounds like a beer rather than a question.
No, it would range like from validation as well, because these models, and I think in Africa you don't have that many records to validate these things. But up to your last application, then that niche changed through time. I was wondering if some similar study could be done, like using pollen data, for instance, because that kind of niche stability is one of the most basic assumptions that is used for all the climate reconstructions. And if you show that all these animals are changing their responses to climate across since the LGM, well, what about plants? And
I would love to do that. So yes, that's definitely have a chat.
Yeah, no, I think pulling together and thinking about how we can use this in an Africa context, where we can use it, what data sets we can take. I mean, using Manu's CREST model to get paleoclimatic reconstructions to validate this, I think would be super exciting to do. I mean, we're already starting to think about that, but how do we do that in a more systematic and across the continent sort of way? I think would be really exciting, and hopefully there's other people in this video call who are also excited about that, and we can motivate people when we meet up in Rome, at least some of us, to think about this and how we really can start to integrate some of the paleo data sets and the model outputs and really apply this in an Africa context to really get some validation of those models and to use the paleo data in a nice way to move everything forward.
And to me, I would say also the exciting possibilities, the validation, but also potentially rethinking how we do this kind of debiasing and downscaling in a way, in a data-driven way, rather than a moment we do it and then we kind of just check that we're doing all right. We started, to be honest, a few years ago with this grand idea and lots of ideas on how we could do better downscaling, better debiasing, which were data-driven. And then, as I say, the data sets were so messy that we went, no, there is absolutely no way we can leverage those data to come out with rules on how to debias, because if two sites 100 kilometers apart can be 25 degrees in difference in temperature, there is no way we're going to do anything with that. Do you take one? Do you take the other? Do you take the mean? Yeah, all those options are probably incorrect except for one, or maybe none of them. So I think that's also what I would be very excited to think about, is really, can we think about improving those outputs, because we know that the models will have a lot of limitations. Sure. And reshaping those models by taking away what's good of them and trying to, in a way, slightly fill in the gaps and sort out their limits, I think is really interesting for ecology and evolution, and is essential for that, because that's what we need.
Okay, yeah, I'm being told that my tea is nearly ready.
I will not get in the way of your tea, Will.
That is the cue for the end of the meeting. So thank you very much for a fabulous talk. I think it's got a lot of people thinking, which is like the whole point of this. And so, let's keep thinking. And those of us that are in Rome can keep thinking some more. And if you're not in Rome, then keep thinking anyway and be in contact online. So thank you very much. It's been super to do the talk. And thank you very much.
Thank you.
Cheers then.
Thank you, and bye, everybody.
Thank you. Cheers.